Welcome to Forging Links. Forging Links is the voice of European social democratic activists with an Anglo-Dutch flavor. The podcast is an initiative of a union and the platform aiming to empower political activists by developing their skill sets, sharing their stories, and generating social, environmental, economic impact. We're trying to promote the idea of politics with love, solidarity, and prosperity. If you want to know more about a union, you can visit our website. We'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dunn Street and the people from Socially Democratic Podcast who have helped us behind the scene, our producer, Mike, and most importantly, you for listening. So, enjoy. Thank you very much. Lianne Schuuring, how are you?
I'm very well. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
How are you?
I'm doing very well. Really excited to be here with you. So we will be discussing you. You are a Staten lid, which means a kind of, is it a provincial councillor role, essentially?
I think we usually refer to it as member of the provincial parliament.
Cool. So,
but it is also a provincial
depending on
councillor.
whatever your political system, electoral system is. So you represent the PvdA, Partij van de Arbeid, the Dutch Labour Party in the province of Limburg, which is on the southernmost corner of the Netherlands. You live in Maastricht, which is, I believe, the state capital as well, or the province capital.
Yeah.
And you've been a member of, basically, you've been an active party social democrat for about 15 years now.
Yeah, since 2008.
And this is your second term as a elected representative. Today we want to know more about what motivates you politically, how's your career developed, what your aspirations are, and essentially more about your love for the region and your story. So maybe tell us a bit about yourself from your side.
Yeah, so I have been a member of the Limburg Parliament since 2019. That wasn't really the plan, to be honest. Before that, I worked there as an assistant for the representatives at the time. And then I sort of discovered how interesting I thought all these policies areas were that the province is working on. And I also felt a bit more connected just to the province in general, because I moved here in 2007 to go to university, and I planned to stay here for about 3 years, but 15 years later, I'm still here. We actually bought a house here a few years ago, so I also plan on staying for quite a bit longer. And so that, changed things quite a bit. And next to that, I also work for another organization that is a little bit loosely connected to the Dutch Labour Party. So it definitely started out very small, and now it's pretty much what I do full time. So that's very interesting.
Oh, that's really cool. So you studied there, you expected to kind of move back or do something else, and then you kind of stayed. You joined the Labour Party around the time that you moved, or is it? Are there any relations to that?
I mean, it was a couple of months after, and it didn't really had anything to do with me moving here. I think it had more to do with the fact that, I was 18 at the time. You were sort of growing up and trying to figure out what it meant to be an adult and everything that comes with it. And I was really frustrated at the time because the Dutch elections actually came earlier than planned because the cabinet fell earlier on. And so the general elections happened just before my 18th birthday. And I was really pissed off about that. And then a little bit later, I think I read it in a book somewhere where it said if you really want to sort of have a bit of influence, you should join a political party. So I thought that was a very good alternative to voting, and I just basically compared all of them and picked the one that I liked best at the time, and still do nowadays. It was a good choice.
And I mean,
but it didn't really have anything to do with me starting university or moving here.
And then you wanted to be politically active. How was the early activism? Because some of the impression I get, especially with more parties that have been around for a while, is that there's some archaic structures. You have people who've been there for 30 years and they're just used to having meetings as, kind of meeting their pals. How did you manage to overcome those early days?
I At the same time as I joined the main party, I also joined their youth organization, the JS, Jonge Socialisten, and they had a local chapter. And I think the first activity I went to was one of theirs. And honestly, that was just, I mean, I had a really good time. There were nice people. We hung out afterwards for a bit, went out for a drink. And that's sort of how I started going to more activities and also getting to know some people and then helping organize some of their activities. And then later I became a board member of the local chapter here. And then through that board, I was connected to the local board of the Labour Party and the provincial board as well. And so then I very slowly started to get to know more and more of these people that were active. And I sort of slowly grew my way into it, basically. Yeah.
And now your role, in terms of your job, did you always expect to be doing this kind of role? I mean, we'll talk about it a bit
No,
more detail later on, but growing, you're now really an elected politician. Is that something you envisioned for yourself, growing up? Is that something you
no,
wanted to
not at
do?
all,
Or
actually.
what were those dreams like? And
For a very long time, when I was still in school, I thought I wanted to be a teacher. But then in university, I thought I really wanted to work for the European Union. And I actually also chose my master's in European Union law. Um, but I sort of came back from that idea because it is really interesting subject matter. But I also discovered that I really like um, the sort of local level when it's about policy and government because it makes things a lot more concrete. It's closer to where it happens, and that I actually like that a lot more. And so after university, I didn't really know what to do. I was working in a call center for a couple of years, and then the provincial Labour Party they had a job opening for a for an employee to help on policy matters and organizational stuff. And so I applied for that, and that's sort of how I um, rolled into the active side of politics. And once I saw that for a couple of years, I realized how interested it was and how nice it would be to actually do it myself as well. And that's why I applied to be a candidate then. But it was definitely more of, yeah, it felt a little bit like a coincidence almost, I would say.
so
Yeah.
your first elected position was on the provincial level. Of course, you've been active on many
Yeah.
levels, on the local and regional or the city level. But how was that as in terms of a leap of in policy? Was it because you'd come from outside the region, you'd been living there for a couple of years, and then suddenly you're on a whole different locality to what you are. Maybe the region, but representing a city can be very different to representing more a whole region. There's much Limburg is known to be much more rural than other parts of the Netherlands.
So it's a very sort of stretched out province. So it's relatively narrow, but if you go from south to north, like it takes quite a long time to get there. But because I was already working on the provincial level since 2015, I had sort of 4 years of seeing how this works and going to all these different places to really get a feel for it. Um, and so in that sense, I did have a good idea of what it would entail and what it would be like. Um, there was a bigger difference than I expected, though, between being sort of behind the scenes and actually being a representative myself. Yeah, the gap was larger than I thought it would be. But instead of like getting to know the rest of the province and how this works, I had quite a good idea, I would say, before
And you're still talking about
I
the
started.
the difference of being, behind the scene. Is it accountability that's the difference? Is it the campaigning that is the difference? What really touches you in terms of on a personal level for you, the
I
difference?
I think accountability is part of it. I think it's also the responsibility that is connected to that. Because if you're working behind the scenes, you see all the processes, you can offer up ideas, you can help in the execution of certain plans, but you're never the one that's responsible and therefore also accountable for the decisions that are made. And I remember my first speech in Parliament. It was about goat farming. Um, and before I knew it, like I had people calling me, like business owners or people that were living next to a goat farm that had all these concerns. And um, so that really sort of drove this point home, like, okay, I am the one that has to vote on this. Like this is like it's a much bigger responsibility and a much bigger feeling of responsibility than I expected before I
And do you think the
started.
party was well equipped at preparing you for that? In terms of, because sometimes you're on the list and suddenly an election,
Hmm.
in the Netherlands, you have a list and whatever your number is on the list, it could be such that you get many more seats than expected. How did that work for you? Did you feel prepared? Did you feel like the party gave you enough support now that you transitioned from
I
being
I
behind the
think
scene to the front?
I think as much as they could, they did. Because on the provincial level, like I was with the same group of people for 4 years. I had already done all the writing sides of it. We had trainings in like debating and speech, giving speeches. So I really feel like they prepared us to the point that it's possible. But then, of course, it's always different from actually being there, and practice doesn't feel the same
Yeah.
as doing it for real. So
I mean, how, do, how,
there
does,
will
how does
always
then
be a
that
bit of a gap.
compare? How does then that compare with if somebody didn't get if for you, if you didn't get those 4 extra years, working behind the scenes, do you think that transition would have been much more challenging, or what would have been the challenges
I
there?
think so. I think if you don't have it, I can imagine that it's much more overwhelming. Starting from very little things, like I already knew my way in the building very well. I already knew all the IT systems that we were supposed to use. I already knew all the staff members that are working there. I already knew all the other members of parliament from different parties because I worked with them before. Um, so all these things, they're just little things, but I think if all of that is new at the same time, I can imagine that it can be quite overwhelming for people, and it takes quite a long while to find your way around everything and knowing where you have to be, and yeah.
And then, of course, Maastricht and Limburg border Germany and Belgium. And the European Union, as you mentioned, is of course one of the founding states is the Netherlands and Belgium. Tell us more about that historic relationship, because I believe there is a very special status in terms of Maastricht or Limburg and how that developed.
I mean, Maastricht, of course, like the building where we have our provincial meetings is where they signed the treaty on the European Union. So every time when we go from our office to like the meeting hall, we pass the official copy of the treaty and like the monument for that. So it's always sort of top of mind because of that as well. And then of course the border aspect, it's really difficult to miss because for most of the province, the river, the Maas, is the border, and so that means I live like 200 meters from the border. It's really right there. But in order to cross it, you have to go to the next bridge. So it's a little bit further away. Um, but it doesn't, sometimes it doesn't even feel like a border. Like especially the historical houses, like they look the same. Um, the dialect, the local dialect is the same. So you can tell it by like the different license plates on cars, and the road sometimes changes a little bit, but it is, yeah, I think it's such a regular part of everyone's day to cross the border all the time that it has become a very common thing. And also sort of for me at least difficult to imagine what that would be like back in the day when of course it was much more prominent. Um,
But
and
then
therefore it was also very strange, for example, during the
COVID,
COVID
yeah,
lockdowns when
yeah.
suddenly
How
the
was that?
borders were very strong again. And I mean, especially the smaller roads, they had these like giant roadblocks, so you couldn't pass them. And you had to go through the highway, and you had a special permission slip that you were allowed to cross the border, that your employer had to sign, for example. And even the footpath has like these big gates on it, so you couldn't cross. It was a very physical thing suddenly, whereas usually it's not at all.
Did it feel more like something that like a military policing type of security response, or did it feel like a health response? Like what impression did you your neighbors have from it?
I mean, I think the idea was, of course, based on the health and safety policy. So I understand why they did it, why they wanted to restrict movement. But because the physical manifestations of that was in the form of like gates and walls and big concrete blocks, it felt like it was almost like the safety policy thing. Um, and sometimes it doesn't make a lot of sense. Like the way things are structured now, there are certain people that are really depending on stores on the other side of the border, for example, and now they weren't able to go there. There's a lot of people that have family members on the other side of the border that they weren't allowed to visit. Um, so I think, yeah, I think from a lot of people that was a very difficult time, and it was also sort of a celebration when it opened up again, and they had all these things that you could go to the border, order your groceries, and somebody would go to the supermarket and bring them back and stuff like this. And it's,
But the people adjusted to that, right? So we're
I
moving,
mean, there wasn't really a choice, right? You had to.
but then they had to in the sense that, but then do you feel that this is something of a experiment to remind people of the importance of, you know, internationalism, open borders, you know, cooperation?
Um, I would say at least regionally, definitely, it was a good reminder of that. And I mean, people definitely want to keep these borders open, of course. I think there's also a lot of people, especially if their family is traditionally from this area, they sort of consider this one region and not necessarily something that would span the entire continent or something. Um,
So in that, I mean, there is a relationship between the people who used to mine coal in Limburg and Maastricht, and they would travel around the mines. This is probably pre World War One, and
yeah,
then
so
when the when borders started popping up and nationalism started to grow, it had quite a disruptive effect. 'Cause
yeah,
yeah,
so in Maastricht there were never any mines, right? So that's more the eastern part of Limburg, so near Heerlen, for example, and they are right on the border with Aachen on the other side. And that area had a lot of coal mining for a long time, and sometimes people would work in one spot and stay there. But I think especially earlier on, it was much more common to sort of go around, see where there was work, and then you would work there. And sometimes it was in Germany, sometimes it was in the Netherlands. And I think this you would see this in more fields. For example, factory workers. I remember the first factory in Maastricht. They would get most of their employees from the area around Liège because there were already some factories there, so there were more people who knew how to work these machines, and then they would come to Maastricht to work here. So it was much more common to cross the border to look for work. And also because for a long time, these borders didn't really exist. Like for a while, most of Limburg actually wanted to join Belgium when they became independent. Limburg as a whole for a while was both German and Dutch in the 19th century. So these national borders weren't as strict and definitely weren't really as enforced as they were later on. I think World War One was a big turning point in that because, of course, we remained neutral, but right across the border in Belgium, there was a lot of destruction, basically a lot of fighting. So I think this was a very good reminder for the first time that people really had to look towards the rest of the Netherlands and also were sort of lucky that they were on this side of the border. But it's been a bit of a mixed bag. There's still people that in Maastricht that would prefer to be Belgium today, and or at least feel closer
mm.
to the regional culture that is also across the border in Belgium than to the rest of the Netherlands.
And then you're in your second term as the provincial councillor or the provincial representative. You recently had a coalition with the Farmers Party, 3B,
Hmm.
the Liberals, VVD, the Christian Democrats, CDA, and the Socialists from SP. And of course, you guys are from PvdA. Could you tell us just roughly how these coalitions come about? Because a lot of places in Europe don't actually have a very constructive concept of working with people that during the campaign you're probably campaigning against them, and you're trying to convince people to vote for you and not vote for them, and there's all these campaigning tactics, and then suddenly you're turning around and you're in power, and now you have to, be friends. Of course, there's a
Yeah.
civil aspect to it, but there's and a personal aspect to it. But there is this. Is it as Tell us more about the process, the culture behind it. Because, for example,
So
where I'm from, and when I was a councillor in London, we just win outright. There was no very little idea of coalition building. We just you win the whole government and you get to do mostly what you want. It's very rare that your party will get voted down unless there's a rebellion within the party. But the Netherlands, people like that they have this coalition
it is
building.
a very different system. So the elections were last March, and here I think we had 27 parties on the ballot, and it's a very direct representation. So they divide the amount of votes that were cast by the amount of seats that are available, and if you have enough votes for one seat, you are elected to parliament as a party. So I think at this point we have 11 parties in the provincial parliament, and there are 47 seats, and that means that you have to then talk to everyone else to see if you can find a majority, because there's never one party that has the majority. And so this time the BBB, um, it translates to like the farmer civilian movement. They were the biggest party in the end. They had the most seats, but they were not even halfway up to a majority. So they had to find other parties to work with. And then basically you have a lot of meetings and a lot of different phone calls about all the different topics, and you see if you can come to an agreement that everyone is okay with. And of course, in negotiations, there's always some things where you're very happy with, and some things that you have to give in a little. Um, and then you have to think like, is this too much? Is this still acceptable for us and our voters, or do we have to go back and talk about this again? So this it can be quite a long process, and the more parties you need to find this majority, then yeah, the more complicated it gets, of course. And I think this is changing a little bit in the Netherlands. You would see a lot of coalition governments also on the local level with maybe three parties. But nowadays, because there's so many more, it's often four, five, six, seven, maybe even. And that, of course, creates a whole new dynamic. So it always takes a while. We were the first province in the Netherlands to reach an agreement with five parties. And yeah, as you said, they go from all across the spectrum, from the sort of more right liberals to the Socialist Party, and a lot of things that are in between. And we're just, yeah, they just started up before the summer. So we're finally ready to go, I would say, and see if we can actually
In your in your
make the changes
in
that we
your
discussed,
experience,
of
does
course.
it
Yeah.
does it flow more from a personal connection, and you've seen like where there is personal connections, these negotiations move forwards in a more constructive manner, or is it the clearer the party message during the campaign is what leads? Where's the balance there? Like, how have you experienced it? How have you seen that develop?
I think there is a combination of both, because, of course, it is about the content about the of the agreement, what you're talking about. But in the end, you also have to reach an agreement and trust that all the other people are also gonna uphold the agreement. So there is definitely a level of personal connection. And I think it's a lot easier to talk about the difficult topics if you feel that the other people that are at the table also are there in good faith, trying to find the best solution, might disagree with you, but still in the end want what's best for the provincial government or the province as a whole. Um, and I think if you have a feeling that somebody is there just to have personal gain, or that somebody is trying to trick you, you would never sign such an agreement with them, of course, because you need to know in the end that you can work together. So personal relationships and trusting the other people, I think that's always a big part of negotiations and working together in general.
I mean, that's really interesting because when you look at the public's trust in government, there are some saying that is waning and people have less trust in government. And then you're faced with an issue whereby you're a whole nother level of trust where you need to trust that they will actually govern and you need them to govern in the way you agree. How do you balance that? Because, it's like the public doesn't trust you and now you're going in knowing the public doesn't trust these people and you have to find ways to trust them.
I think it is definitely an issue that people have less trust in government. I think in the Netherlands, trust in institutions is still relatively high compared to a lot of other countries. Um, we don't have any obligation to vote, but there's still relatively high turnouts, especially for national elections. And I think you can also see that that it is working somehow. So, for example, the party that is the largest party now, the BBB, it's a new party that was also founded because people were unhappy with how things were going. So instead of going around the system, they basically did exactly how what the system is made for. They founded their own party, they joined the elections, and then so many people agree with them that they actually won with a much bigger margin than anyone expected. So that is then sort of how they how people tell that they want things to be different and that they want things to change. And so then you start having conversations about it. And on some points, might mean that you are on complete opposite sides of the spectrum, but then on the other side, maybe you're very close, or you at least have the same starting point or the same values that are underneath that. And that is, yeah, you sort of move around each other carefully, trying to see where you do have these connections, where you don't, where you have to agree to disagree, and just accept that from each other. And but there is of course also a limit to that. There are also certain things that you cannot step over, and that you say like, okay, if you want to do this, we're not gonna join into this conversation. You will have to do it in another way, or even preferably like if you drop that point, then we can continue.
So is it
But
more,
yeah, these are sensitive topics, which is why they're always
yeah,
held in secret. And you try to move away as far as possible from everyone else to do this.
which is, yeah, you're trying to build trust, but you need to have trust that the information you do share is constructive enough, but not public enough that you can be immediately scrutinized without the end result. Because of course, negotiations are lengthy. Um, on a personal level, you're currently working in banning for vereniging, which is kind of like a jobs union or association, or how does that?
Vereniging is the Dutch word for association.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's a
So it's an
jobs
association.
association, or
Sorry?
so banning. That's related to jobs, employment, work.
No, no, not at all, actually. Willem Banning
Oh,
is the guy that
my
it's
bad.
named after. And um, he founded the organization originally under a different name over 100 years ago. And he was a board member of the first Social Democratic Party of the Netherlands, and later also one of the people that started the PvdA, the current Labour Party. And he was also a theologian and a professor, and quite active in the Dutch Reformed Church as well. And he founded an organization based on a Quaker organization that he found in the UK, actually called the Woodbrookers. And they started to organize a lot of different activities where you could basically talk to other people about these sort of deeper questions, and also learn more about different policies or techniques. And the organization always continued basically, and now they sort of focus on the crossroads between religion and politics, especially social democratic policies. And yeah, so they organize different activities around that.
That's interesting because before you used to be the commercial manager of a Protestant church. And
Yeah.
so I can see this like overlap within you as a person, within your role as,
Hmm.
essentially a Christian and a social democrat, or a Christian social democrat, depending on how you want to look at it. Tell us more about
Yeah,
that
that's actually also
overlap for
how
you.
I found this because sorry, what?
Yeah, just tell me more about that overlap, within yourself and within your role.
So I always grew up Christian. My parents were always active in the church. I sort of stopped for a while when I was in university, but found my way back basically. And at one point, they were looking for volunteers because the church I go to now is also an historical monument, so they open it up for people that want to visit it from time to time. And I actually told them that I was available to help with that. But then they told me they were actually looking for somebody to work with them on different events that were hosted there as well, and to do everything surrounding that. So they called that the commercial manager position, and that's how I started there. And next to that, I worked then for the political party. So I did it both, but in two different positions for a while. And I actually at that point did not know that the Bonningvereniging existed. And I found out about it somewhere last year. And then I realized like this, it's quite a specific niche, but it's almost precisely my niche. So I actually went to the website to sign up to join as a member. And then I saw that they had this job opening, and I thought that would be really fascinating. So I applied and got accepted there as well. So I started there last September. I've been there for about a year now. So yeah, also again a bit of a coincidence, but a very happy one, I would say, because yeah, for me it feels like a very logical connection, but I don't think there are a lot of people who feel this way. So
And then, of course, the Dutch Labour Party was not organically set up. It was a merger of several different movements. And what I mean
hmm
by organic is it wasn't set up on its own. It was set up because organizations came together, and one of them, a lot of people sometimes overlook, was essentially the Christian Social Democratic movement came together. How does that how does that how is that relevant today when we're looking at the close connection, for example, with the Green Party? So GroenLinks, PvdA are now going to be sharing a list.
hmm
Both parties, I would say, come from a very secular angle. They are a-religious. The members,
no, I would disagree.
tell me,
I would
tell
disagree
me,
with that
tell me.
because both GroenLinks and the PvdA came from a merger of different parties. And in both of these mergers, both the parties that created GroenLinks and the parties that created the PvdA, a Christian party was one of the parties that merged into them. Also, GroenLinks was also founded by, among others, a Christian political party. And there's quite a long tradition of Christian socialism. Um, and of course, there's also uh, branches of socialism that are very anti-religion, and there are branches of Christianity that are very anti-socialism. But there has been a, a combination of this since the beginning, I would say almost.
But then today, how do you feel that connection is waning or strengthening? And if such,
I
what do
would say
you
it's.
want to do about it? Or do you want to do
I
something
mean,
about it?
the form of it is changing, of course, but I think that also has to do with the fact that Dutch society as a whole has become really secularized and not very religious in general. I think also in Dutch culture, it's not very common to talk a lot about your religion. I think it's very much considered a personal thing that you do in your own church, in your own home, but not something that you talk a lot about in public debate, for example. So, in that sense, it's a little invisible, maybe sometimes. But I think the ideas behind it and the content of it, so to say, is still very much alive and very easy to point out.
And does it for you, does kind of Christian socialism, does it come from a benevolence angle, or does it become from an institutional angle? What I mean by that, does it flow because it's a good thing to do good, it's a part of your faith to do good, or is it
hmm
from an institutional point of view, which is the church does good or us as Christians do good? So, where for you on a
I
personal
would
level?
say it's I think it's even different from that. I would say that if you look at the values behind it, so for example, the idea that everyone is of equal value is very strong in Christianity, it's very strong in socialism. Justice, the value of fighting for peace, the idea of having responsibility for your community, um, contributing but not focusing on personal material possessions, but on something that's more important than that. Taking care of each other, looking after the poor, the sick, the homeless. Um, they're all very concrete assignments, almost, I would say, in Christianity as well. So even on just how you see the world and your place in it seems very compatible to me. Um, Even the idea of sort of love and acceptance over judgment, which is a big part, at least in progressive Christianity, I would say. Um, so yeah,
Do you,
for me, it seems very logical almost to
do you think
connect the two.
in terms of representation within the Pavendale, within the Labour Party, do you think there is good enough influence or representation at this moment of Christian social values?
Um, I, I find that a difficult question,
Indeed.
to be honest, because it determines really, it depends on what you see as the values. I think that there is an issue with just a lot of people sort of not knowing a lot about religion in general, I would say, starting from our generation and younger. Um, so people also don't really see the value of religion sometimes, or religious institutions, which is sometimes a bit difficult for me. Um, but I think that the values that I find important were in the end also the values why I chose this political party, and I think they're still very well represented
So that's
in politics
values
today.
in a broader sense, but is there a
Yeah.
specific group or a meeting as such that you feel that you're able to collectivize and bring those ideas of social Christianity and give it as an input into the party in terms of structure, in terms of the party itself, in terms of values, the way we write our manifestos for elections, the election process? Does that mechanism exist for you to have that input and for others who share Christian social values?
I would say it's not institutionalized, but I also don't think it has to be.
And then,
Because in the end, like, I don't need the PvdA to be a Christian party. I need them to do things that in the end um, create change in the world in the way that I would like to see. And what I would like to see is also inspired by my faith, but um, I don't need to have a very outspoken Christian politician in order to make that happen.
okay, well, I mean, we could really go on about this cross section
Yeah, and I
because it's
think,
a very challenging one for a lot of people. I mean, some people have split from the Labour Party, in the past, for the reason of they want their particular faith to be more represented in a direct manner, and you know that there are legitimate reasons for that because you want in democracy you want better representation, more specific representation. But then I also think it's a responsibility of a party to be more open to welcoming those voices and those critiques
mm,
and such. And I just feel like if it was more available in an institutionalized way, it could have a much more positive impact on the party because then those voices are always going to be there to remind us of the differences that we share and the values that we
I
have
mean,
overlap for us.
it could have. I think one of the difficulties, and that's also why, for example, I never chose to join an explicit Christian political party, is that within Christianity, there are, of course, a lot of different ideas and different churches and different thoughts. And so, if you have an organization or an institution that is explicitly Christian, there's often also a lot more conservative voices in there that are quite strong. And for me, um, I would say I am almost more radical and progressive because of how I interpret my faith. And so for me, it also feels nice to not have these more conservative voices around a lot of these ethical issues. And I think, especially within Dutch culture, um, and the way it has always been since I was growing up, I don't really miss this more structural part. But this is one of the things that sometimes the Banningvereniging tries to do when there are policies that are explicitly also about religious issues, that they write some input, for example, or organize something around that. Yeah.
So, just on a, you recently went on vacation in France and you had a breakdown. Could you? I mean, it was an interesting story because it's we're talking about
Yeah, we
overlaps of region, Europe, and one of the benefits of the European Union has been, you can travel anywhere really quickly and freely, apart from, of course,
yeah.
more remote parts of or islands, but nevertheless.
I mean, we didn't go to a very remote part. In a very long Dutch tradition, we went camping in France. We went to Normandy, which is, I mean, it's a good area, I think, to visit at least once. And we were there by car, so we had all our camping gear in the back. And when we were driving home halfway through, our motor, the car got overheated, and we had to stop. And we had to then figure out how this works in another country. And we found out that if your car breaks down next to the highway in France, you have to call the emergency number. So we had to call 112. And then when we had somebody on the phone, they only spoke French. So that was a good chance to practice my French because it's not that good. But we did manage to make clear where we are and that we needed somebody to come pick us up. And then they had a contract with a garage owner who came and picked us up with the car and brought us to his garage. And then we actually had to go home by train. Um, so that was a bit of an extended adventure. We had to spend an extra night in Lille, which was actually also very nice because I had never been there before, even though it's honestly pretty close to where we live, relatively speaking. And the interesting part there is that the northern part of France and sort of the Walloon region of Belgium, all the way up to Maastricht, sort of feels like, if you look at the architecture and the landscape, it's really similar. So you could actually tell, like, oh, we aren't that far away. I think it was like 300 kilometers or something, so it's not that close either. But it was definitely this feel of like, oh, there is a cultural connection. But because of the systems and the institutions and the borders, um, there's still quite a lot of hurdles to then jump over to make it home. But we had a good train connection. It took like 4 hours the next day before we were here. And then 2 weeks ago we could pick the car back up, so that was nice. It's here again. It's working.
That's cool. So, do you just to wrap things up? Really appreciate all this time you spent with us, but I just wanted to know more about some of the knowledge or exposure you get. Have you been reading, a book lately about, and politics generally, or some books
Yes,
you've recently come across?
I would say definitely reading is probably one of the main ways that I get these new ideas. And the last book I read while on vacation was a book. It's written in English, but I read the Dutch version. It's called, in English, it's called The Tyranny of Merit by Michael J. Sandel, and it's really about how this idea of a meritocracy and giving people positions based on on merit, it can actually be very problematic as well, and that um, it focuses a lot on the equality of opportunity, but not necessarily on the equality of the outcome in the end, and that this creates this idea that people who do rise to the top through that system have a feeling that it's because of what they did and that they did it by themselves instead of by this whole system and culture that has supported them, and that the people who do not rise to the top um, sort of are made to feel like it's their fault as well that they lost this societal game, um, even though there are so many other factors that play into that. And he also writes a lot about like American universities, which is not really applicable, I would say, to the situation here. But yeah, I think it was a very interesting book.
You mentioned America, but like from a European side, do you think that is also relevant in the sense that we when you look at different parts of Europe, France being an example where there is a lot of challenges about how people get to where they get to, and there's a denial of or that there are institutional influences.
Yeah. No, I think it's definitely a more general thing. What I meant is that he specifically talks about, for example, American universities and their application processes and how only children from rich families basically end up at the top universities. But I think the idea that you got where you are in life because of you worked very hard and because of your own values and I think it's very prominent. I think there's quite a lot of people also in the Netherlands that if they're very well off, they would say, "Oh, but that's because I worked very hard for
Mm.
it." But they never mentioned that they also grew up in a family that supported them or that they had a connection through family friends that might help them to get their first job or like all these other little things that can make this huge difference in the end, that are depending on much more than just yourself. It's depending on the network that you have, the family that you have, the society and the chances that it gave you. And then looking back on it, it's very easy to say like, oh no, I put so much effort into it and I was really smart about making decisions.
And then anything else? Any other sources that you want to
um
mention?
Yeah, there's actually quite a few. I mean, for me, reading it sort of goes up and down. But if I look at the past year, I read two books actually by a British author, George Monbiot, or Monbiot. I never really know how to pronounce his last name. But the first one I read, it's called Out of the Wreckage, and it's about I think it's called, the subtitle is like a new politics in times of crisis. He wrote it, I think, just after Brexit or when it happened in the UK. But this was really a book that really got me fired up again about like finding like leftist policies and a new story to tell in politics. And I think what's really nice at the beginning, he lists a set of principles. And immediately when I read that, I was very excited because I think there is this idea, and I don't know if this is everywhere, but at least in the Netherlands, it is said very often that the political left doesn't really have a story anymore and it needs to sort of soul search for its identity and the things that we have to tell people in order to sort of create this movement again. And I think this really points out like we already have a really good story and we already know the values that we want to promote. We just have to think about how to do that today and keep sort of retranslating that to new context. And the second book by him that I read is it's about agriculture because in the provincial politics I work a lot on agricultural policies as well, and it's called Regenesis, and it's really about completely rethinking like the global food system and agriculture. And I'm still chewing on it a little bit. I don't know if I agree with him completely, but it's really thinking about a completely different system and how to sort of overhaul it completely. It's always difficult, I would say, because I think part of being a social democrat is that you sort of realize that you are not starting from scratch, right? We already have a system and we sort of take slow steps to make it better. And this is definitely a bit more radical than that. It's really, but that makes it very interesting.
I mean, that's always been the challenge between I mean, in the Netherlands we have the Socialist Party and we have the Labour Party. I mean, you can argue that they both share exactly the same values, but then maybe in the implementation, one wants much more, in terms of the economic system and social and cultural system. There, that's where the differences are. But then you see that silver lining in the Netherlands where there's this coalition, not and compromising is not seen as a negative word, but more as a constructive way of doing politics.
And I think sort of going back on what we talked about earlier, that the PvdA is a merger of different parties. This of course happened just after World War II, and it really was this idea like we have to sort of let go of smaller differences, and we really have to force this super broad coalition of everyone that is willing to say, like, okay, we want to rebuild a society that is very democratic, that is trying to sort of go past the war that just happened and really work on peace in the decades to come. And I think that's a very nice sort of parallel with this new combination with GroenLinks that we are making today. Like this idea of like, we know that there are differences, but the challenges that we are facing are so big that we have bigger fish to fry, and we agree on that. So let's work together and really try to force some bigger changes because of that. And yeah, it's going to be an exciting few months to see if we're going to be able to make that happen.
Thank you very much for everything you've said. Really appreciate your time. I wish you all the best. I think you make a strong case for your passion for your region, the province, and being a representative in politics. Any final words? Anything you wish to keep us alive and aware of?
I mean, I really enjoyed it today. I'm very honored to be the guest here today and to talk about these things. It's always nice to have a little bit of more time to go more into depth about these things. Um, yeah, I think that's it,
It's
honestly.
wonderful. Yeah, I appreciate it. Well, I hope you have a lovely day, and I hope all your hard work pays off in politics. It doesn't always, and it's all about staying patient and fighting it through. And I hope the coalition brings fruits that make the region and your constituents' lives better.
We're gonna do our best.
I hope so. Thank you. Take care.